She's unmuting as we, yes, there you go.
Yes, I am now unmuted. The first reading is taken from Dewey's writings on education in 1916. It is no accident that all democracies have put a high estimate upon education, that schooling has been their first care and enduring charge. Only through education can equality of opportunity be anything more than a phrase. Accidental inequalities of both wealth and learning are always tending to restrict the opportunities of some as compared with the opportunities of others. Only free and continued education can counteract those forces which are always at work to restore, in however changed a form, feudal oligarchy. Democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife.
Wow.
The second reading combines two statements Dewey made on the subject of learning. The most important attitude that can be formed is the desire to go on learning. All learning begins with when our comfortable ideas turn out to be inadequate, offered as wisdom for the journey.
May we walk in its light.
May we walk in its light.
Thank you, Vilma. We just sometimes have to do a bit of technicality here. Did someone catch where the clicking was coming from? I don't think it was an environmental soundtrack of crickets. I think it was, I don't hear it. Are we okay? Whoever heard that? We good? No clicking? A nod would be good if we could. No, we're good.
I think it was mine.
Oh,
My microphone.
gotcha. All right. Okay. Last week we talked about music, and the point I got out of it was the idea of we are composers of our life, not just of music, but that we are composers of our life, and we build into our life what we want it to be, and we are the writers of the tune. We are the writers of the tune and of harmony that we choose. But we also receive tunes from elsewhere, from other people, and from circumstances, and I just mean that metaphorically, that something else comes at our life that we didn't write and we didn't choose, and then we have to compose our life accordingly, or we don't, and we renegotiate that composition that is our life as we go. And so I enter this sharing time. I just invite you into looking and thinking and hearing from somebody that who died in 1952. I was born in 53, so I have not lived simultaneously with this person, but the wealth of writing that's there that we can dip into together. So I invite you into that. He said in a work called Time and Individuality, the first PowerPoint slide, Peter, made me think of the idea of composing. Art is not the possession of the few who are recognized writers, painters, musicians. It is the authentic expression of any and all individuality. If you're being an individual, you are composing. You are composing a life. You're composing your life. And so I'm linking that with what we were thinking about with music to what John Dewey is going to be sharing with us. And I ask, the next slide is an artistic rendering of this gentleman, John Dewey. And I'll just give you a little bit of background. So when you're looking at this slide, just take a moment as if he was here. I would love if we could do that, if he was here and sharing. This is a little bit about him that gives you a bit of background. Born in Vermont, one of 4 boys, took a bachelor's degree at the University of Vermont. And while he was there, he was exposed to a couple of ideas. And this is one of the thoughts that really impressed me each time I dip into someone's life who's lived a thoughtful life. The influences on the person, the influences on your life. You've probably even forgotten their names sometimes, but they had an impact on you. When John Dewey was in University of Vermont, he was influenced by people working in the area of elementary experimental psychology. And that has a scary sound to some people, but the experiments were, how do people learn? How do they think? How do they, what does that have to do with education? And the other big influence at University of Vermont was the beginnings of the idea of Darwin's evolutionary theory. And they were taking evolutionary in an organic sense and applying it to learning and thinking, not just to biology, but to psychology, to learning. And he spent a couple of years getting his bachelor's at the University of Vermont. And then he taught for a couple of years, public school and high school. So I wanted to ask on the screen, how many of you have had any point in your career, either voluntarily or professionally, been in teaching? Could you please raise your hand if you've been in teaching? I knew there'd be a wave of hands going by here. There's a lot of folks that have been involved in that. So you're probably familiar in one way or the other with maybe the thoughts of John Dewey. A lot of the thoughts he had have been corrected now or changed now, but he taught school, which is really important if he's going to be talking about education. He has experience of that. He took his doctorate in philosophy at the School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins University. And there he was, again, influenced by that organic model of evolutionary thought, that thought can grow, that we can learn, that we can have an idea and then it be supplanted by another idea or adjusted by that idea. He taught philosophy and psychology at the University of Michigan. Those two subjects are much more separated now. But the focus, again, was that organic thought in terms of child psychology, the children's growing, the way they think. He was a member of the American Federation of Teachers. And then he moved to the University of Chicago and stayed there for most of his career. It was just newly founded then, actually. He was there at the beginning of it. And there again, the importance of experimenting with different ways of learning without not just imposing our way of learning on everybody and then seeing them fall where they may, but experimenting with types of learning. Mistakes were made, theories were lifted up and thought to be the be all and end all, and then that was adjusted too. But he formed something called, and you may have heard of this, the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools, where he actually had students experimenting with different ways of learning to see what worked better for whom. Now, we certainly haven't, I've had two children who had learning challenges that got the tests that weren't around back when Dewey was doing this work, but also bumped into schools that weren't ready to help them with that. And I'm sure we could fill the screens with stories of learning issues that were or were not met. Over disagreements with the administration about those schools, he left University of Chicago. How many of you have ever been in a disagreement with the administration of wherever you worked? I just like some hands there. I can't imagine that probably the same amount of hands go up. Well, he had those, which I haven't been able to find out what it was about, but it led to his resignation there. And then he taught at Columbia. I was mistaken. He did not spend the rest of his career at Chicago. It was at Columbia in New York City. And again, in New York City, he bumped into philosophers and psychologists of all sorts of thinking, and he absorbed them. He thought about them. He wrote on education, on art, on politics, on religion. He wrote a book called How We Think and Democracy and Education. That was back in 1916. He was co-founder of something called the New School. And I'm just going to read you this. I had no idea this existed. I knew what it turned into, but I did not know this. And this would be something I'd like to say after in this abundant blessing that they did this. There were 4 or 5 philosophers, psychologists, John Dewey included, teaching at Columbia University at the time, when they took a public stand against US's entry into the war. And they were censured by Columbia's president because the war at that time was something they were deciding to do. But instead of just objecting, they then decided to create a model for higher education where ordinary citizens could learn from and exchange ideas with other scholars and critics and artists and represent a range of intellectual and aesthetic and political orientations. And that's something, we strive at West Hill to hear something different. We're just beginning to get different in some of our screens, but the idea of exchanging with people, particularly those with whom you disagree, to be able to listen to that. And they collaborated with scholars in Europe, particularly in Germany, And those same scholars that were doubtful about the war became aware of the danger of the Nazi movement and protested that, so that the changes that by being exposed to other ways of thinking, they changed their own direction. And when Hitler came to power and the purging of the Jews began, they obtained funding to provide a haven in the United States for any scholars whose careers and lives were threatened by the Nazi regime. And they called it the University in Exile, the University in Exile. And it was given a home at the Columbia University New School. And evidently they sponsored over 180 individuals and their families, providing them with visas and with jobs. And some of those refugees stayed at that school for the rest of their career. And some of them went all over the place and impacted the world that way. It was incorporated into the New School in 1934, and now it stands as, if you've heard of this, the New School for Social Research at Columbia University, which is an amazing thing, and started that. So John Dewey was part of that. I just wanted to give you that little bit of history. I didn't know it before, and I knew the New School of Social Research, but I had no idea it was fomented in such a rich intellectual gathering like that. He became the president of the American Philosophical Association. And when he retired in 1930, he continued his participation in the public sphere. He defended thinkers, Trotsky, Bernard Russell, whom he disagreed with. He defended their right to express themselves. And he wrote his major works at that time after he retired. So all those of you that are retired, you cannot stop thinking and creating. He wrote the book Art as Experience. He wrote A Common Faith, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and Freedom and Culture. And so I'd like to just let you see him on the next couple of slides. Peter, the next slide. These are just some thank you to Dennis for guiding me to a Commons way to get pictures that are copyright free. But this is John Dewey as a young man. Next, a little bit older, and this is some of his writing. This is one of the desks he wrote some of his words on. Next. I could describe these for those of you that don't have a screen, but you could look them up online. This is him comfortably reading, which he never stopped. You'll see a picture hanging above his chair there, Chinese art, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Next picture. Art on the left. He became aesthetically rich with art from all over the world. And then his other focus was education with children. And he actually met with children and talked with children and worked with children. Next slide. That's what I was mentioning. He was invited by the president of university in Peking to come from Japan, where he was, over to China and do some work with the teachers and with the students. He lectured, and his works were widely accepted there and widely rejected there, which is what happens everywhere with new ideas. The next slide shows some of the ways he was honored during his time. Time magazine had that picture of him on their cover, and the United States 30-cent stamp. Some of you may have had that in your collection. That's John Dewey there being honored. And of course, honored and also caricatured. Next slide. That's probably the more flattering of many pictures that were taken, that were drawn of him by people that were objecting to some of his ideas. Why should we change the old way of education? It worked for those for whom it worked. And so they objected to the changes that he was bringing there. But I'm glad he continued. Dewey's focus on three areas that we're going to look at closely blend him so beautifully with the West Hill moment. I want to share some of the thoughts that he innovated and was so criticized for in his time. But he could have come and done a grounded, guided growing so beautifully with these thoughts. So I just want to tell you a few things that about him that fostered these thoughts that make him blend beautifully with that. He grew up in a Congregationalist family. How many of you, if you have a United Church background, your background of that background was Congregationalist? Any of you? Because the United Church was made of Congregationalists and Methodists and a couple of Presbyterians. So if any of you had that, that background of Congregationalism, the influence there was very much each congregation is its own authority, its own accountability, and a very democratic view of doing things. By college, though, Dewey was a little more doubtful of some of the doctrines and was leaning towards a more liberal evangelicalism. By the time he hit 21, he'd had an experience, and some of you could call it a rich experience, a deep experience, a spiritual experience, and it just was Dewey and the universe. And he felt the richness of the enormity of life, and he felt at peace and quiet with it. And he took that as it didn't need doctrine, it didn't need particular beliefs to experience being a human being, to being a full human being. So after about 35 years of church life, he left the church. He was at the University of Chicago, and he no longer attended. He saw the human journey as having meanings of its own that could be explored and shared and changed over time, but it needed no rescue from some higher authority that was going to tell John Dewey what was real, what was not, what was important, what should be believed. But about 30 years later after that, he didn't use Greta's phrase because, of course, Greta wasn't born yet, but the idea of the off-label benefits, as Greta's often said, of religion was that idea of community, of being together, of the exchange of ideas. He would have applauded the Ethical Culture Society. He would have applauded a lot of the humanist efforts to say we still should gather together. And so he began thinking about religion, but from a naturalistic point of view. And so he looked at the words, very much the way we've done it here. The word faith became to him the idea of something worth acting on, something worth putting your effort in, your agreement to. And then it would be the experience of life that would be your authority, what you're gaining from your own experience and the experiences of others. So he wrote a book called A Common Faith. He wrote it in 1934. He wanted to transform religion into something that could advance the idea of participation of all, of engagement of all, because the richness of all was what we needed to make good decisions. And so he wrote this book, and he didn't write it for people that were quite comfortable with an evangelical faith. He didn't write it for even liberals that were seeking to build a bridge between science and religion. And he didn't write it, he said, didn't write it for militant atheists who were strongly against every idea of religion, but he wrote it for people who had said goodbye to doctrine, who had said goodbye to the requirement of the belief in something supernatural, but wanted to experience life as whole, wanted to experience being part of nature, wanted to experience the richness of life shared with other people, who wanted to be transformed and grow and use their intelligence and their imagination and collaboration to make life better for others, to make that a moral imperative for themselves. And so I just see him sitting at West Hill using, he said the name God. He didn't have a use for it particularly, but if he was going to use it for something, he would use it for what happens when people engage for the good of all. And then he developed that into his philosophy, a naturalistic philosophy. I know there's a lot of words here, but the idea of looking at life naturally. And so he embraced life. You can hear these words that, and the whole Vision Works group 15, 20 years ago didn't even look at Dewey's work. And so I'm just loving that the resonating happens with them. He looked at life as precarious, dangerous, scary, unpredictable, and beautiful and stable and patterned and regular altogether. And he looked at life naturally because he felt that would include everybody. And he had elements of his philosophy, and I'm just going to read them to you, and you can resonate with them or you can wonder about them. But he thought this is what should go into our view of life. We should be curious. We should try things on, and we should explore. We should be humbly aware of our fallibility, the fact that we could be dead wrong while feeling very right. He wanted it to be that we had a view of life as changing, as organic, as growing, as evolving. He wanted it to have the idea that physical life and social life go together. He wanted it to have an idea of human beings as connected. He wanted the idea of using knowledge as wisdom for growing together and bettering society. And he wanted to use the knowledge to say that he felt that a democratic idea with people participating and engaged was the best way to live life. But he didn't just say it. There's a long list of things Dewey did. I won't tell you this because it's a silly little digression. But my father was a minister and he married people. He also married my mother, but he also married people in ceremonies. And one day I was playing the organ for him and I had to leave the organ and go to the back of the church up into the balcony to watch my dad say this without smiling, because every time he said it with me when we were just going over things, he started to smile. Because I don't remember the bride's name, but the gentleman's first name was Dewey. And my dad had to say, Dewey, do you take? And he smiled every time. And so I went up into the balcony to see if my dad could do Dewey, do you without smiling. And he was beautiful. He was very, very appropriate in his ceremony. That is a complete digression. But when I said Dewey, I had to share that with you. So the idea of what Dewey did, of what Dewey was doing during his lifetime was rich. He supported the Pullman strike, and you can look these up. I won't go into the details of it. He was part of the International League for Academic Freedom. He had belonged to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's what it was called then. And he sat on the executive of that. He held commissions to free people from oppression, academic oppression and all. He marched for women's rights. He marched for indigenous rights and many other causes. He was the president of the League for Industrial Democracy. He started the Students for a Democratic Society. So he did. He didn't just say, he did. And you've seen some of the pictures of there. So I'm going to invite you for the next slide, Peter, to see that his words do not resonate beautifully with what we try and focus on here at West Hill. Grounded in life's interconnections, Dewey said human nature exists and operates in an environment. And it is not in that environment as coins are in a box, but as a plant is in the sunlight and soil. The self is not something ready-made, but something in continuous formation through choice of action. We are grounded in life's interconnections. Next, guided by love. What the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all its children. Beautiful. Next, growing in wisdom. In order to have a large number of values in common, all the members of the group must have an equable opportunity to receive and to take from others. There must be a large variety of shared understandings and experiences. Otherwise, the influences which educate some into masters educates others into slaves, which is why we encourage, even in our policy on language, to share views that are different from other people, as long as we do it respectfully. Next, next slide, Peter. Every serious-minded person knows that a large part of the effort required in moral discipline consists in the courage needed to acknowledge the unpleasant consequences of one's past and present acts. Now, I won't ask you to put your hand up, but I'm hoping that you have looked back on your life. Well, I shouldn't hope that, but I'm guessing that you would look back on your life and think, oh my goodness, why did I do that? How could I possibly have said that to so-and-so? How could I have done that? I have a truckload of those in my life, things I've done and things I've said. And here Dewey is saying, hey, that's part of moral development, to be able to look back and evaluate and to still stand and to still say, I'm going forward. The next part of that slide is the real process of education. I've jumped there. The good person is the one who, no matter how morally unworthy he has been, I retained the male pronoun there just, because I thought it was very fitting. Is moving to become better. So I'm going to just show you, and I'm sorry it slides because I think it's easier for people to read as well. But if you're not seeing these, I hope I'm reading them with as much clarity as possible for you to catch that. Dewey focused on 2 subject areas. Well, no, that's not right. He's subject on a whole slew of subject areas, and he did it well and deep. But I want to pick out 2 for West Hill's growth and growing in wisdom here. And again, if you email me, I'll send you these things of wisdom. But I want us to picture Dewey right here with us, sharing in his sharing time these thoughts to inspire us. And for those of you that are teachers, he did such a lot of thinking about education, but not just education in the classroom, but a lifelong idea of education, which is what we're doing right now together, which is learning together. So I'm going to ask Peter to go through these slides together. I'll read them clearly as I can for you. Again, you can get them later, but about learning. And then we're going to talk about thinking, but right now it's about learning. Cease conceiving of education as mere preparation for later life. Make it the full meaning of the present life. The real process of education should be the process of learning to think through the application of real problems. I could ask anyone on the screen, does anyone have any real problems? Well, then he's asking us to think through them together. Next, Peter. The aim of education is to enable individuals to continue their education. The object and reward of learning is continued capacity for growth. So continual growth. Next, it is the office of the school environment to see it that each individual gets an opportunity to escape from the limitations of the social group in which he was born, and to come into living contact with a broader environment. I could ask how many on the screens think differently than some of the social groups or the worlds you were in when you were younger, and you are not there anymore. You can resonate with it, you can remember it, but it's not where you are right now. And it also, of course, could be that you won't be in 20 years where you are right now. And so it's an ongoing thing. Next. Any genuine teaching will result, if successful, in someone's knowing how to bring about a better condition of things than existed earlier, which is, I hope, every time we gather like this, that when your screen shuts off and you go into your week, we can bring things about a little better for having shared wisdom together. And the last slide on education, I like this one so much. The most important attitude that can be formed is that of a desire to go on learning. And there may be days when you say, no, please, I don't want to learn anything else. No, I don't want to change my mind about anything. I'm tired of learning. And then you realize, oh, I'm learning about that attitude, and you get back in the saddle and learn. So I'd like to wrap up with his thoughts on thinking. I've just gobbled these up. I love them. Each one of his thoughts on thinking is worth thinking about. And so we're just going to sort of jump into them. And again, if you can picture John Dewey and some of those photographs right here with us, sharing his thoughts, that we would thank him at the end for being our speaker this Sunday, because he has so much to share with us. And here's his challenge to us about how we think. First slide on thinking. The path of least resistance and least trouble is a mental rut already made. It requires troublesome work to undertake the alteration of old beliefs. That's because we hang on so tight because it is comfortable. Old ideas give way slowly, for they are more than abstract logical forms and categories. They are habits, predispositions. They are deeply ingrained attitudes of aversion, things we don't like, and preference, things we really, really do like. If you were to look at an old order of service or an old vision works of West Hill, you would see a different way of describing ourselves, a different way of putting things that we've moved away from or past. And it came slowly. It was slowly. We changed slowly, but it's because of our feelings. We dislike something, so we don't want to let go of being against that. And I could ask on the screen, how many have you been against something and you are now not against it. I've got, again, a truckload of those. And how many of you have been for something and now you realize, I don't think that was such a good idea. I don't think my way of doing that or thinking was such a good idea. Next. All learning begins when our comfortable ideas turn out to be inadequate. I love that because it's not so horrifically judgmental. It's just we realize our idea is inadequate for the task. It's just not going to work anymore. One can think effectively only when one is willing to endure, I love this, to endure suspense and to undergo the trouble of searching. Because as soon as you say, I don't know the answer here, so I'm going to hang in suspense. I love the idea of suspense also being in suspension. You're hanging there, not knowing something. It's not very comfortable sometimes, but it's freedom, and it's where a new and beautiful idea can come in. Next. Anyone who has begun to think, I don't know if he means for the first time, anyone who's begun to think about something places some portion of the world in jeopardy. I love that. Ruth Gill, I pick on her all the time. She starts to think about these issues and something starts to shake out there. All of you that have engaged in an issue that matters, when you began to think about it and you think we need to do something differently, you've put the world in peril because something has to change. Put some portion of an apparently stable world in peril, and no one can wholly predict what will emerge in its place. Little scary there. Next. I love this. The phrase think for oneself is a pleonasm, meaning you haven't said anything there. Unless one does it for oneself, it isn't thinking. I love that. So thinking for yourself is really thinking. If you're doing it otherwise, you're not engaging yourself with those thoughts. You know, we try to welcome everyone to engage with their thoughts because that's where the growth happens. That's where the richness can come to life for each other when we think for ourselves. Many of us have been in organizations, in groups, in families where thinking for ourselves was not encouraged. In fact, it could have been highly discouraged. I am working with someone right now whose family is shunning them for a stand they are taking just generally on the issue of gay rights. I have also worked with someone who took their family's name and whited it out on the family tree because they disagreed with a social justice issue that's very important right now. There's some people who have not been encouraged to think for themselves, or the minute they did so, they were disagreed with, they were shunned, they were ousted, or they were just ignored. And many of us on the screen can remember being ignored for an idea we had. And I hope we've had enough experiences with West Hill that someone brought a thought and it wasn't immediately slammed down to the ground because it didn't match. And that takes that suspense, hanging in suspension to say, I'm going to listen to you. We do take a stand here that we encourage the sharing of anything as long as it's, lifting up the values. We don't encourage, violent statements, but we ask each of us to engage with each other respectfully. And that means not approvingly, but respectfully in tone and in the way we express ourselves. But thinking for ourselves, I'll wager that there's people on the screens here that have thought differently, even in their time with West Hill over time, and their thoughts and thinking has changed. We've had people leave West Hill because we weren't moving in a progressive enough direction, and we've had people leave West Hill because we were moving too fast in a progressive. And one time that happened on the same week. And of course, that also is resonated by, I can play a song in a church service and someone could come up and tell me I played it too quickly, and other people could say I played it too slowly, and they both are right in their own way of thinking of the subjective idea. But thinking for oneself, it's only thinking if that's what we're doing. And the last slide, Peter. we do not learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience. I like that distinction. We do not learn from experience. Somebody was applying for a job once and they put down they had 25 years experience on that job. And it was discovered later that they really only had 1 year experience 25 times, which didn't mean they had learned anything. So we try not to go through life having the same experience 25 times without changing it. We do not learn from experience alone. We learn from reflecting on experience. And so here we try to focus on reflecting on life, on its interconnections. We reflect on love and all that means. Not that we even need to love more, but we need to love more widely. We need to apply love in society to more than we thought before, to more issues than we thought before, and to engage in wisdom, to reflect on the wisdom. And I hope that something that John Dewey said or thought that we've looked at today encourages your idea of thinking for yourself, of challenging other thoughts that you may be sitting there in your head and you haven't looked at, that you think of education as a lifetime experience, a lifetime privilege to keep growing. The poster says, please be patient with me. Life isn't finished with me yet. And I think that's a great thing to say to each other. But I invite you to look up something about John Dewey. He is not the Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System. I put that on the e-blast. That's Melvil Dewey. And Peter looked it up and found out they live close to the Adirondack Mountains, both of them. But I don't know that that's why the Deweys both did their work in education. But look them up, celebrate them. So I'm going to just ask at the end there for the life and time and wisdom and work and activism of the life that was John Dewey. In this abundant blessing, we share the joy.
Share the joy.
Go into your week. Reflectively. Go into your week on the journey of education, of learning, of thinking. Please let us know if there's someone in the West Hill family that's having difficulties, or there's an upcoming worry or difficulty. Please let us know. Phone the office. Phone Annie. She's always, she knows everything. She can tell you all sorts of ways to get connected. And please join us for wellness on Tuesday at 2 for what's hard and what helps. Join us on Wednesday at 2 for the book study on the moment of lift, for everything to do with educating, what John Dewey was marching for, the education of women and children all over the world. Join us on Thursday. Join us, Mike, the coffee host. Thank you so much for doing that every Thursday, Mike, at 10. Glenn fills in he's my Ann Jackson beside me here. By the way, it is really, really warm in this room here. Glenn is sitting here in a short sleeve shirt and shorts. I am sitting here in a long sleeve shirt and pants. He is cooler than I am, but we always knew that Glenn was cooler than me anyway, wouldn't you say? Jill would agree. But anyway, I'll come more appropriately dressed next week. Anyway, have a good week. Keep warm. I'll see you on next Sunday. If not before, let us know how you're doing. Farewell. Love you all. Goodbye.